Well, we have to go to our guests now, coming right up, Emily Yamasaki and Dag Bu. They're members of Radical Women, the National Comrades of Color Caucus, and the Freedom Socialist Party. And we will have a talk really about the psychology of oppression and on a more basic level, the New York City campaign for a real elected civilian review board. So why don't we go to that? All right, Emily Wu Yamasaki, Na Bui, and
yes.
You both are from the National Comrades of Color Caucus of Radical Women and Freedom Socialist Party. So thank you both for being on today. It's an interesting time to do an interview on racism, isn't it? We're living in this amazing time. So thank you for taking the time to be on Activist Radio.
Yeah, thank you,
thank you
Fred,
so much for having us.
For having us.
Great. You call your organization a socialist feminist organization. And I wondered whether socialism, is it an integral part of women's liberation? It hasn't been so much in the past, and I go back to the 1960s. Is that new, or do you think socialism has always been part of the women's movement, just not a part that people talked about?
Well, that's a good question, Fred, and that's why our organizations, Radical Women and the Freedom Socialist Party, are unique in our identities as socialist feminist organizations, because there are a number of feminist organizations out there that don't see capitalism as the root of sexism and misogyny, as well as racism, homophobia, transphobia. And so they're, just trying to work for this reform here or that reform there, and thinking that they can win, kind of a kinder, gentler form of capitalism. And so as revolutionary feminists, we really see capitalism as the root. We have to get rid of the entire system, just throw out the whole thing and replace it with socialism. And so, and we are unique on the left in terms of, Radical Women bringing a truly revolutionary perspective to everything we do, whether it's around reproductive rights or race issues, racism, police violence, and so forth. But, there are a lot of organizations. I think probably now NOW is one of the best known, which I would consider, a bourgeois feminist organization. And, their main goal, and actually many nonprofits today that call themselves feminists, are really just, they're basically working to get another Democrat in office.
Sure.
And as socialists, we definitely don't see a Democrat in the White House as the solution to our problems. In fact, we can look back at many, all the Democrat administrations and be able to also point to, how they're really the twin party of capitalism along with the Republicans. But Na, do you want to add there?
Yeah, we recognize with that analysis of capitalism being the root issue, we are able to see that, like, you need to attack it at the root. You can't, there is no, as Emily said, there is no like reforming it. There is no gentler way, because we can look at Roe v. Wade and how all of that is now being stripped back, and any kind of reforms that people have fought hard and longed for can be rolled back under capitalism.
Thank you. Do you think, this is actually just my opinion, do you think socialism is part of why you have so many white youths joining this march, where in the late 60s, 68, there is hardly any whites in the demonstrations against racism, and you get such a huge white participation in this movement. Do you think part of that has to do with socialism? I mean, the surveys of people from 20 to 35 years old look at socialism more favorably than capitalism. So I'm wondering, does that explain the huge number we're getting for these demonstrations and possibly their energy? They're just sick of the system, and racism is just part of it. I don't know who wants to answer that.
Not even answer.
I can speak from a very personal perspective. I am within that age bracket. I'm Vietnamese American. I grew up in an anti-communist household because my parents were refugees from Vietnam. And from what they believed and what immigrants, refugees, and anybody in this country is sold is that the American dream is possible for all and that it's a land of equal opportunity and so forth. And I grew up in poverty, and I grew up around seeing police violence. I grew up seeing racism at the individual level, at the community level, at the systemic level. And it was clear that this wasn't built, like capitalism was not built to have everybody included in these opportunities and the supposed pull yourself up by the bootstraps. And so at some point it was just clear that this system itself, this economic system where profit is placed above people, is not working. It's not working for the majority of people. It's working for very few people, very few corporations and bosses and so forth. And obviously there's all this talk about privilege and stuff like that, so that as a way to keep us divided, as a way to say that, okay, whites make more on the dollar versus blacks, or straight people versus queer versus, and so forth. And so that's how I arrived at, if the system that we're living under is not working for all of us and was built as a way to exploit us, and that means we need something else. We need something that actually is about the majority of the people and not just a few, not just the 1% or ruling class or however we want to call them. So I imagine that for other people coming up and is in this age bracket, they're also seeing too that no matter how much this American dream is sold, no one among them is going to be able to really achieve it. And that is just going to, the 99% is just widening, as we can see, and now under the pandemic, we're seeing how that's even blown further wide open, where, again, the people who are most decimated by coronavirus is Black and brown people, immigrants, people who are on the front, working as essential workers and so forth. So that's obviously just my perspective on it, but I think other people are feeling that squeeze as well and can see how socialism would be a better alternative, or a revolutionary alternative to capitalism.
I think
so
also
maybe
just
that,
in terms of
go ahead.
Racial divisions, we are seeing a tremendous, display of multiracial solidarity, which is so heartening for me as a queer person of color, who has done this anti-racist, anti-police violence work, and social feminist organizing for many years. At the same time, during the 50s and 60s, one of the things that the powers that be did find the most threatening, I think, was not only Blacks standing up against, racism, Jim Crow, all the legacies of slavery, but in fact, the combination of Blacks with whites and Jewish activists who were standing shoulder to shoulder with them in so many of those marches and sit-ins. And so when we're united as a multiracial, united front, that's when it's the most threatening to the system. And I think that we've also seen that with the most recent protests, how the powers that be, with their arm of the police, have calling in National Guard on their behalf, have gone to such lengths to put down the protests, because they do feel so threatened by, if we can take the streets for these kinds of protests, we can do so much more.
Yep. I think that's part of the reason that the establishment maybe even doesn't talk about socialism being a part of this movement, because it is threatening to the establishment. We were really lucky to have this woman on. She's a writer, maybe last year. Her name is Deepa Iyer, and she wrote a book, We Too Sing America. And she was talking about something she called the racial bargain, and I think she's from Indonesia. And she said, when you come to America, she's an immigrant. When you come to America, she felt she was forced into what she called a racial bargain. And the bargain for her was accept the racism as it is in America, and we will treat you white. But if you don't accept that, you run the danger of not being treated as a white. Now, that was a radical revelation to me, but is that part of what radical women talk about, the forcing of people into racial categories and the attempt to push people not of color not to organize and fight back? I don't know.
Well,
Maybe
sure,
that's not
yeah.
fair. You probably didn't read the book, but I
No,
highly
I'm not
suggest
familiar with
but,
it. It sounds very
okay.
interesting.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
radical women, as well as its sister organization, the Freedom Socialist Party, both are linked by their the commonality of the socialist feminist ideas and program. Do see race as a social construct that was created, at the outset of capitalism in the United States to justify the theft of Native American land, the genocide of Native Americans, the slavery of Africans, the super exploitation of Chinese on the railroads, and then on and on through the centuries with Jim Crow, and so, we really do see racism as endemic to capitalism, just as we do see sexism as well. As feminists who are revolutionaries, going back to one of your earlier questions, the reason why we are socialists as well as feminists, and we don't see the two as being something that you can separate from each other. We see them as being inextricably linked, and that is because we do believe that in order, as Na said, in order to get rid of racism, in order to get rid of police violence, in order to get rid of misogyny and sexism and white supremacy, ultimately we have to get rid of capitalism. And we go back to in our Radical Women Manifesto, available on the radicalwomen.org website, we talk about the origins of women's oppression as being rooted in the establishment of private property, and capitalism, is one of the highest expressions of that economic reality. But before private property, we had an egalitarian matriarchy, not the flip side of the patriarchy, but where there was no hierarchy in a negative way, between genders or even definitions of genders in that way. Native Americans had, two-spirit people in their communities, and so gender and sexual orientation weren't even categories per se in the way that they are, these boxes that people are labeled in under capitalism.
Yeah, the Iroquois had a form of democracy that I think the founding, unfortunately, calling them the founding fathers, looked at the Iroquois structure of democracy as well as, and I think the Friends looked at that too when they built the way they reaching consensus in the Friends meeting house. I'm going to ask you: are there any men's organizations that are really this broad in scope? Combining anti-racism, anti-sexism, probably Islamophobia, anti-labor. Are there men's organizations that combine this with a general anti-racism agenda? And looking back, in the late 1960s, the Black Panthers actually did this. Are there groups? I know the Black Panthers are still around. I'm not sure that they're particularly a great many of them, but are there any men's groups that are making this coordinated effort to expose the capitalist system?
I can try to take a stab at that. So I'm not aware of any men's groups. The men's groups that I've heard that talk about like anti-racism or anti-sexism, anti-patriarchy is usually kind of like a grouping of people who are coming together to look at their individual problems around it, as opposed to recognizing that it's a systemic issue. And then for us, as Emily had mentioned earlier, for radical women, we recognize the need to be able to train women, especially when so much of, at the time when we were founded, like so much of the spaces, political spaces, did shut out women, and women's leadership weren't, because of the sexism, women's leadership was just not as valued. So we wanted to have this autonomous space to be able to cultivate that. Whereas in the sister organization, Freedom Socialist Party, it is, we're multiracial, multigender, multisex, whatever divisions, like everyone is welcome, because we recognize that we all need each other in this fight for a better world, because we can't just have it be completely separated from one another, when we know that everybody is needed to actually make this revolution that we know would make the world a better place.
Sure.
Or socialist revolution, rather, because that could be co-opted too.
To
just
that
have
point,
time.
if
Go ahead.
I could just say to that point,
Yes,
we are
please.
membership organizations, and so any women identified individuals are invited to check out Radical Women, again at radicalwomen.org, and people of all genders are invited to check out the Freedom Socialist Party at socialism.com, and then if Nak could tell you a little bit about the Elected Civilian Review Board campaign, that's something that we mentioned in the flyer that Fred, you were so responsive to.
Yeah.
Yep.
So
that
sorry, go
go
ahead,
ahead.
Fred.
No, you go ahead.
Okay. So we've already talked about how racism, sexism, and all these other isms are endemic to capitalism, but we also recognize that capitalism and cops go hand in hand, and there is no doing away with the cops if we don't do away with capitalism altogether. So as a way to give people the chance to fight back, communities who are most affected by police violence, whether that's Black and brown communities, women, immigrants, Muslims, and the list goes on of who's all abused and harassed by the police. We developed the Freedom Socialist Party and Radical Women, along with other organizations and individuals, developed the Campaign for an Elected Civilian Review Board, which the idea itself was actually implemented back in the early 90s in LA, but here in New York City, it's been going for the last several years, and we know that police violence will continue to exist. There is no ending police violence, again, without getting rid of capitalism. So this is a chance for communities to fight back. And the main tenets of the Elected Civilian Review Board, which I'll call ECRB for short because it's a mouthful, is that we're calling for elected representation from communities that are affected by police violence. We're calling for it to be empowered so that they can make binding decisions and binding disciplinary decisions. And we're calling for an independent prosecutor, because we recognize that the DA will not prosecute their own friends, the cops, and so forth. And the campaign itself is multiracial, multi-generational, and again, multi-gender, and all these ways that we're divided. We recognize that this is an important tool to be able to fight back, to be able to have the cops be accountable to the people as opposed to the powers that be. We recently had a press conference on Monday that was wildly successful, and it was basically talking about how our council member, who's the primary sponsor, will be introducing it to City Council in New York City.
It's such compelling arguments, and I think it was on your website. I was reading about the 5,000 police department employees working in the city schools, and in I think 2017, maybe that was the most recent numbers, they had made 882 arrests. 95% of the arrested were Black or Hispanic. So I guess in a slightly larger question, the fact that it is capitalism doesn't really stop you from trying to rectify a system or fix some of the worst excesses of this system. And of course, I think the cops have to be taken out of the schools. They don't work in the schools. They're racist, and they part of the prison pipeline that we see in the schools. So I guess that wasn't even a question because we're out of time. But
Yeah.
I want to thank you both so much for being on. I really do appreciate it, and just hearing those ideas, I think is really important. The more ideas, these ideas, we can get out to people who haven't considered them. I think that's how we grow, a socialist agenda essentially in this country. So I want to thank you for your work as well.
Thank you.
And,
do we have a few
Thank
more
you so much,
seconds, or
Fred.
are we out of time?
No, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to say too, you invited us, you responded to our Being with the Comrades of Color caucus of our organizations, and we're a unique body in the left under our organizations that is a reflection of how both of our organizations center the leadership of the most impacted, the most targeted, the most oppressed in our communities, in every issue that we focus on in all our work. And I think the mothers of color who have been coming out and organizing against police brutality are such an illustration of why that emphasis is so important, because they're not only the mothers and the grandmothers of victims, but they are themselves targets of police violence and murder, like Breonna Taylor.
Sure.
And at the same time, their own experiences on multiple fronts with racism, sexism, and economic inequality, they know all too well the inseparable connections between police violence and daily issues in housing, healthcare, jobs,
they're
education.
the experts for the rest of the country,
when these women rise, when the most oppressed rise, they lift everyone in our communities. And both of our organizations are centered on that perspective. So we think this is a really important time for everyone to get involved and join the fight. We're at a turning point.
I believe that absolutely myself, that it is such an important time to talk about these issues. So thanks again. I'm sorry I kept you a little bit longer than we said, but I really enjoyed talking to you. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much,
Thank you, Fred.
All right. Bye now.
All right. Bye.